right. Well, welcome to our podcast on corporate social activism. My name is Jeff Davison, and I'm the CEO at the Prostate Cancer Center located here in Calgary. And I'm a relatively new AEG member, but I've been fortunate to attend many of these great events which focus on how to run our businesses better. Corporate community building has always been important to Alberta business as it fosters relationships between companies and the communities by which they operate. By investing in local initiatives and supporting local charities, businesses can build goodwill and establish themselves as a valuable member of the community. This, in turn, can lead to increased brand loyalty and customer support, as well as improved employee morale and retention. Additionally, community involvement can help businesses to stay connected to their needs and concerns of their customers, which can help guide their decision-making and ensure that they're meeting the needs of their target market. So the question we're asking today: what does it mean to be good corporate citizens? And frankly, are we doing this right? What are the risks? And are we having any positive impact? With me today is Joni Avram, who is an expert in social change, marketing, and behavioral science, and who teaches social and business marketing at Ambrose University. Hello, Joni.
Hello, Jeff.
This is a really important field, and I think it drives a lot of questions in the business community right across Alberta. So let's start with, what made you get into this work?
So I actually started life as a lawyer, and I never wanted to practice. I wanted to work in what I call the court of public opinion. And since then, I've worked in politics and public advocacy and public policy. And I really got into sort of more on the philanthropy, social change about 15, 17 years ago when I started business. Cause and effect marketing. And at that time, one of the big gaps in the market was helping not-for-profits and foundations tell a better story about their work, helping them understand and communicate their impact. Because impact and funding are connected. And so my first focus on the early years was really on the communication side of the table. But having worked on both the giving and receiving sides of the table, I started to understand what people were responding to, what they were wanting, and helping my clients communicate those or respond to those needs more effectively. And over time, I would say in the last 7 years or so, I've really focused away from helping them talk about impact and helping them more achieve impact and through my work. And so that's really about designing programs that produce positive outcomes, that produce, what I call human flourishing, that helps people become better, happier, healthier, more connected, more productive, and more purposeful. That's my goal. And I became like kind of consumed by this work about 5 years ago. I was so interested in the nuts and bolts and the science of change that about 5 years ago, I went and got a master's degree in behavioral science. I wanted to get better at this work myself, and I wanted to be better, help my clients get better at it too. And the reason that we're here today is because one of the things that I've come to understand is how much of the work around social change and social impact, which is intended to produce good outcomes, often does not work, and in fact often does harm. And that's what I'm here to help people change. And I think most of the reason that people tend to stick to the status quo is they don't realize there's an alternative approach. And so my goal is to really give people that alternative, show them a different path, and to encourage them to be part of this, not part of the problem.
So your mission is really now to help change outcomes. But let's back up a little bit. Maybe go to the 30,000 foot level here for me. Why is social change something that businesses need to be focused on?
Well, the short answer is that's what their audiences expect of them. That's what their networks expect. That includes employees, customers, public at large, shareholders, and investors. Everyone is looking. I think that the reality is that most people have, well, not the reality. The research suggests that a lot of people have given up on governments being able to lead change, and they're looking to have businesses change. And so it's not just a nice to do anymore, it's more of a must do. But it's not new to 2023. It just has happened in the last 10 or 15 years. The social change has been happening, or businesses have been leading social change for decades. And maybe what's changed now is that people are more focused on being more activist in weighing in on controversial political issues and feeling like they have to take strong stands on things. And so one of the things that I think we're going to get into today is how you do that is super important, because if it's not done well, it can actually create unintended consequences that do harm to not only to the communities, but also to your business.
It's funny because you and I were talking before this, just about every sector right now is saying that the workforce is so mobile and they have to compete differently for talent. And I think we've heard that loud and clear across Alberta, that talent is one of our biggest challenges right now in business. If you're not thinking about engaging in a way of social impact, are you actually far less likely to attract good talent? And is that something that talent in a very mobile workforce where opportunity is much more aplenty globally, are you going to attract that talent if you're not thinking about social impact?
Well, I definitely know that it's definitely something that younger folks are thinking about, but I wouldn't even say it's a generational thing. I think most people want to work for companies that are doing something meaningful and have a purpose, a clear kind of clear direction, a clear sense of mission. And argue that a lot of organizations underestimate their impact on the community just in terms of the way they do business. Like it, and I think I often say that most businesses are social businesses, not only provide jobs and help the economy, but they make people's lives better in real, tangible ways. Like imagine what you're like. Pete the Plumber, which is a local business. Pete the Plumber it's more than a service. It's more than, just pipes. It's actually plays a big role in keeping people healthy and happy. Imagine what we would be like without plumbing in our lives. And so those companies a lot on price and service, but they don't talk enough about their social impacts. And it's a simple example, but I think it's one of those things where people tend to underestimate talking about the bigger picture when they're talking about their work. And so I think it's really for companies have an opportunity to understand and speak to those outcomes, those bigger picture outcomes in their marketing efforts and in their employee engagement efforts, because all things being equal, an employee is going to probably choose to work for you based on your mission and your values over anything else. So really it comes down to understanding values, being able to communicate them in ways that reflect who you are as an organization authentically and reflect what your audience and your network cares about. I think this kind of mission-focused approach, that's really what makes brands stand out, and that's what helps them attract loyal workers. There are some good examples of this in Calgary even. I know the folks at Local Laundry, for instance. They're a company that produces local clothing, and local sourcing is a big conversation for them, making their products sustainable, providing local jobs, promoting stronger communities. Rather than buying something that has to come on a truck, you can buy it local and you can support local. That's the bigger story that they're good at telling. And that's an example of how, a company that's doing the same kind of thing, but talking about it differently and achieving, or their process is different and their focus is different, is what they're focused on. And so there's a concept also in corporate philanthropy called shared value, which is really about doing things that help grow and grow the community. And it creates this sort of symbiotic relationship where the more you grow your community and build their skills and abilities, the more they can help you grow your business. That would be, say, a food company that can build shared value by building the skills of local farmers. Like I know that there are restaurants here in Calgary, Alberta, that promote local buyers, and maybe they support them through some kind of system of supply chain. Those kinds of things are ways of kind of putting your money where your mouth is, not just talking about it, but doing it in a way that builds up your community and builds your business. That's the concept.
Right. And energy companies have been pretty good at this, right? I mean, I think for a long time there's been a push in energy to give back, and so are we seeing good examples of this across the
Well,
province?
I mean, I would say what energy companies have done really well is like the way they've done, and you would know this better than I do, but the way they've really brought down the carbon footprint, the net, and making the energy cleaner. That's a way of responding to the needs of the market, building out communities by investing in communities, and making a network, an infrastructure, a system that works for everyone. That's the idea here.
Do you think businesses actually underestimate their ability to have a real impact on community? I mean, I participated in an event on the weekend, and it was really spawned out of a small local business here in Calgary who said, we can make a difference and we can have an impact to a charity that we want to support. And so they went out and did something about it. Do you think a lot of folks out there, whether they're small to medium-sized businesses, they feel like it's the large companies doing the big impactful things. I don't have that ability. And can they have a real impact?
Well, they can. And I think this problem that the phrase that I like the least when it comes to this, the social change space, is we're making a difference, because saying that you're making a difference is very meaningless unless you actually show what you mean and how you're doing that. And it should go beyond money. It should go beyond funding. It should go like caring about a certain issue. I think it really needs to come down to tangible outcomes. And I'll give you a couple of a big company that I would hold up as a bad example of this, and then I will give you some ideas for a smaller company to do it better. So the company that I often use as a bit of a case study in this space is Bell Let's Talk, which is, I think, an example of a company with a big footprint, a big network, but a small impact. So and here's what I mean. Like, they've generated $100 million in the last several years, 10 years, 11 years, toward mental health programs. But they've come under attack for seeming to be more about marketing than mental health. And even some of the way they treated their own employees, some of the stories circulated in the media around the way they've treated their employees around mental health has come out. And so there's this sense of dissonance between what they're saying and what they're doing. And the other part of it is people don't necessarily see an impact from that program. They know there's a lot of talk. They know that there's more awareness of the issue, especially around January 25th, but they don't see a tangible impact. And that's one thing that could make that campaign more effective. So if Bell really wanted to change outcomes around mental health, they could pick a problem and really work at solving network and all of the force that they have behind them as a big company toward solving that problem. And the one that for me is kind of obvious is is suicide prevention. I read a research report on Bell Let's Talk, and Bell generates some of the highest volume of online suicide content anywhere in the internet, but has done nothing to reduce rates or incidents of suicide. And one of the reasons that the report suggested was because the content to be generic content about suicide in general and how bad it is. But the report suggested that a better way for Bell to engage the audience would be to actually direct people toward telling stories of help seeking and resilient. And the reason for that is that kind of content is actually associated with reduced stigma, reduced incidents. So, imagine what would happen if Bell said next January 25th or before this particular issue, and we're going to show people what help seeking and recovery looks like. We're going to tell those stories. We're going to engage our whole network in repeating those stories and telling those stories and bringing them up and making people aware of those stories. And what could that do to impact incidents of suicide over time? Like that's a big idea that I think Bell hasn't taken on but could take on, that I think they'd be much more respected and much more influential as a corporate leader in this space.
Okay, well, I want to come back to this because I think there's businesses that feel like they don't have capacity and budgets that some of these big companies do. We'll come back to that. I should have mentioned off the top that we do have the chat going, so if anybody has questions for Joni, I'm happy to read them through the chat here. Hussein had a question, and it goes back to what we were talking about just previously. Are you finding social involvement being a prerequisite to attract talent, or do employees seem to adapt the company's social involvement upon being onboarded? Do you have an opinion on that, Joni?
Do they adapt to, can you repeat that line?
Yeah, so like, are you finding that social involvement is a prerequisite, so, in attracting talent, or do you find that simply employees adapt to the company's social involvement once they're on board? So,
I mean,
yeah.
I do think it's individualistic. I mean, some people are going to care more than others. I think generally speaking, as the trend is toward wanting to work for people of all stages of life, but especially younger folks wanting to work with businesses that have a very specific social purpose, articulated approach to the issue of social change and social impact, and how they're doing it. But I think what I'm getting at here is, I think a lot of organizations, they tick the box in this space and they say, we're doing this and this, or we're giving that and that, or we have volunteer days or whatever. But it doesn't come down to some tangible impacts. And that's maybe where I'll go next is I think small businesses, even the smallest businesses, can have a bigger impact than they do if they focus less on just activities or action, more on impact. And so one thought I have is around, I know that it's hard for businesses to, take on a big social issue and change it, but imagine what would happen if you took away, like most organizations on their giving on certain themes or certain organizations, or they give, during a certain time of year. So instead of writing a check to a certain charity, what about adopting, like, for example, adopting an immigrant family? A charity is a one-time thing. It might make you feel good for a day, but adopting a family is a relational, long-term effort. You can help get them settled. You can help them find furniture. You can show them around the community. You can help them get connected. You can help them celebrate milestones. Like, it's an example of how I'm giving myself goosebumps here, but like, I can see what kind of impact a small group of 5, 10, 15 people can have on one family who's new to the community, who needs that kind of, like, maybe hands-on support. And imagine what that would do to your feeling within your organization of having a real impact, and what that impact could have, what that ripple effect could be across the community. It's much more meaningful and just writing a check. That would be one example. And then there's another group in Calgary called the Calgary Youth Justice Society, which has a program that connects mentors with young people who have been in conflict with the law. And I've known some people who've been in that program, and the relationships that get built and the milestones that get celebrated. There's something really powerful about being in that kind of mentoring relationship. So imagine supporting a program like that, either with dollars and with volunteers. That could be another example of a way that you bring the idea of social good and social change, and social impact right down to the very personal level, in a way that people feel like they can be part of it. So, like, imagine doing something like to corporate giving, just as what I would say is just as a something that you do automatically. You might actually you can actually support programs that don't necessarily produce good. Like, a toy drive might feel good, but it doesn't have a long-term impact on the issue of poverty. So that, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that people have in this space, is not knowing when they're doing good and when they're not.
So, and we're seeing in the chat here, Joni, a couple of people have asked for more examples, because I think, the examples tend to say it well. And I think you've given some good examples of, folks that are kind of getting it right. Do you have any specific other examples that you want to highlight, or are there examples of people that we definitely know are not getting it right?
Yeah. There's a company in Nova Scotia called the Seven Virtues. Have you ever heard of them?
Yeah, yeah.
They're they started in like 2006, and the owner was, I remember because she was on Dragon's Den, and she had this idea of buying essential oils from farmers in countries at war. And the idea was to use these oils to make perfume, but to use the money that was generated by the perfume to offer these farmers a livelihood, like to create a dynamic system where the perfume supported local communities and the local communities supported the perfume. And now those local farmers are helping to rebuild their communities after war or disaster, like places like Haiti. And those communities then can educate and sustain their young people. And so in this process, like Seven Virtues is helping, they've helped these communities rebound and regrow, but they've also grown exponentially as a result. So they've taken this big idea. I think their phrase is like make perfume, not war. And they grew from like a garage in Nova Scotia to being sold in stores right around the world. It's a great example, I think, of a good company that does, of a company that's doing it well. Other examples, I think, out there, like I I'm trying to kind of give you like compare and
Yeah.
I often go back to like what and sometimes I'm trying to point out like what doesn't work as a way of showing you how to do it better, because I think there are times when people just assume that when something is well-meaning, it must be good. And there are examples out there of organizations like, well, businesses like Tom's Shoes, which I don't even know when Tom's Shoes was established. Back in the day, they established and they kind of pioneered the buy one give one concept, and they donations with marketing, and it was pretty unique at the time. And they gave a pair of shoes away when anyone bought one, and it was part of kind of built into the ethos of Tom's, and for people who wanted to buy shoes and do good, their option. But
Right.
here's the thing: critics kind of questioned whether this buy one give one model was actually doing any good, because we're starting to notice was that local shoemakers found it hard to make a living when their customers could get shoes for free. And so when you hurt local economies, that doesn't, it's not a sustainable model. And there were also issues around whether people who received the shoes, some of them didn't want shoes, some of them didn't need shoes, some of them already had shoes, those kinds of things. So there's a sort of sense that, especially for Tom's, what they focused on more was on the needs of the buyers rather than on the needs of the receivers. And that, I think, is really one of the fundamental things here, is to really think about what's really needed in the community and how can you uniquely help solve that problem.
So you need to understand how change actually happens, I think is what you're getting at. And what's a good way to think about this when you're wanting to create social impact? How do you make those things sustainable? I always think about food banks, right? Every municipality has probably more than one focused on food insecurity. Here in Calgary, I think it was rumored that there was something like 400 agencies that were focused on it. And so how do you have an impact when there's that much spread in the market too? Because often the challenge becomes businesses, they don't know who's doing it right, who's doing it wrong. Maybe they don't pick the one that necessarily aligns with the most impact or the most alignment of their business and what the outcome actually is. Like how do you understand how this change happens, and how do you avoid from creating programs that are unsustainable?
Well, it comes down to really understanding biggest problem people make in this space. And it's not, it's not so much the donors as sometimes the people who create the program don't necessarily take the steps back that they should to really figure out how are we going to affect change and really succeed. As somebody who does this for a living, the first place that I start is in research. I want to understand who's done it before. I also want to understand like what's worked and what hasn't, because these outcomes are pretty well known. they just aren't widely communicated or publicized. They're well known by academics or researchers, but not so well known by practitioners. What I'm trying to do here is help people understand that better.
Right.
But the bottom line really is about picking one or two things, showing people the path forward and actually focusing on solutions rather than problems, and showing them what positive change looks like, and give. And so, like, one of the examples that I've used is okay, maybe I'll back up. The biggest problem is that many organizations focus on just raising awareness of a problem rather than really solving the problem. And so a good example is in the like alcohol space. So maybe you're I don't know.
Well, yeah, like look, everybody wants to promote responsible drinking. They want to, we think, like, how do we get to some of the examples of, where these big societal issues may exist,
Right.
but focusing more on solving that problem with, impact
Right.
rather than the awareness side.
Than the awareness. So a lot of companies will put, like, they'll slap a drink tag on their advertisements,
Right.
but they don't provide any kind of real information about what does that look like, how does it, like, how would I even do it? And so it can be empty and hollow. I mean, they assume that people have the skills to kind of take that phrase and apply it. We actually need to be walked through the steps for, in some cases. It's a good example would be like the designated driver campaign well,
Right.
it wasn't just in the US, it was all over the place. The designated driver campaign didn't tell people not to they didn't even say don't drink a lot. They said if you're going to drink, just hand over the keys to somebody else. And people, like, I don't have to do anything except hand over my keys, that made it people could behavior because it was simple, and it fundamentally changed society for the better. I mean, I grew up and in the mid 80s, or I was a teenager around the mid 80s, and I remember the shift in attitudes around drinking and driving, and it did it by focusing on a problem, identifying a simple solution, and then promoting the heck out of it. And it worked by, if I think within 4 years of the campaign being established, the amount of drinking had gone down by 25%, and the number of people who identified as having been a designated driver went from 5% to 25%. So these are ways of encouraging positive behavior is a much better way to create than what we normally do, which is focus on the problem.
What about large companies that are maybe, let's take an alcohol company that is taking on other societal issues. Does that have any effect? Have you got any examples of where, like a Budweiser had the Tape Out Hate campaign. Does that work when, often we have a big alcohol company that should likely have social giving or social awareness created in and around alcohol as a box, but taking on something completely different that's going on in society? And does that work? Does it not work?
Yeah, I mean, it can work. The Tape Out Hate is a good example of how the organization or the message is focused on the problem, not on the solution. And so if you don't know, the Tape Out Hate campaign is, it's an initiative by Budweiser to showcase stories, tell stories of hockey players who've experienced racism playing hockey. And those hockey players tell these stories about the very hurtful and hateful things that were said to them as young players, or through their careers. These stories are graphic and they're heart-wrenching, and they're very hard to watch. They're very emotionally charged, and they're intended to create these feelings of empathy that will help end racism. And that's the goal. That's the thinking, I'm assuming. But here's the problem. Like, telling people that racist views are common make them more likely to be repeated. And I'm going to say that people often are surprised by that, but we are highly influenced by the behavior of people around us. We are more likely to engage in certain kind of behavior if we think others are doing it, even if it's undesirable behavior. we amplify and publicize undesirable behavior, the more we are likely to promote more of the same. It's the of what we want to achieve. So these campaigns, they mean well, they tend to fertilize the weeds that they're trying to destroy.
So is it the companies or is it the individuals that maybe don't realize that these backfire effects happen?
Well, it's the people who are in the companies who, and a lot of it maybe comes from people who are in the agency world. And here's the thing. I've worked in an agency world. I've worked in public relations. I've worked in campaign creation. And the biggest goal of most of these campaigns, the biggest like success metric is eyeballs. And so the more dramatic and graphic you can make the stories, the more likely you are to draw eyeballs. If your goal is to just get likes or clicks or shares, but it doesn't work if you're trying to achieve social change. These backfire effects happen all the time. Like if your kid goes to a school with an anti-bullying program, they're more likely to get bullied than if they go to a school without a program. If you tell kids who go into programs that tell them not to do drugs, try drugs or alcohol, are more likely to try both. Family violence awareness campaigns trigger incidents with more incidents of hospital visits and femicide. And then bias awareness, when you try to make people aware of their biases, you're more likely to amplify those biases and activate them. And so, this is really what it comes down to, is that all these efforts to raise awareness about things in a way to stop them makes them grow. And there are incidents out there around sexual harassment at work. We know that years of sexual harassment training has actually created negative outcomes, including men more likely to think that such behavior is acceptable, and women who report are making it up or overreacting. Now, this is an example of how a company is doing the right thing, trying to protect their workers. But the way that those messages are communicated and framed actually has the net effect of making harassment more likely, not less. And that's why after 40 years of training in this space, it's produced negative results.
Wow.
And there's a reason for that.
I think a lot of people will be shocked to find these things out. I mean, we seem like we're focused on the wrong things in trying to do good. So how do we create better outcomes?
Yeah, so the problem often has to do with the way the message is framed and the way we think about the people we're trying to train or educate. I think the biggest thing that I've noticed is that, so when I work in this space, I've talked to hundreds, like thousands of people about social issues and social problems. And you know what? Like people are actually really people who really do want to be part of the solution. But typically these messages get framed as you're broken to be fixed, and we're going to show you how, and we're going to fix you. And so that sort of creates a resistance, like called reactant, react negatively to that message. And so a better way to do it is to frame people as potential heroes rather than potential villains. Show them doing the right things, showing the stories of appropriate behavior rather than forbidden behavior. Focus on solutions, and really telling stories to the people who are getting it right. I mean, I think one of the things that people mistake in this space is we use the wrong role models all the time. We turn the people who are like the bad actors into role models unknowingly, because we put them on pedestal on social media, and we say, look at all these Karens or whatever, and we say, look at all those bad people, but actually that turns those people into role models. And our unconscious brains are so wired to follow the lead of the people around us, that the more we show doing the wrong thing, the more likely we are to get people to do the wrong thing rather than the right thing. I just wanted to say there is specifically around sexual harassment at work, there is a program in Alberta that any Alberta organization can can sign up for. It's called momentsmatter.info. And you can go there, you can sign up for information. There's all kinds of resources available through the Alberta Association of Sexual Assault Services, which is an Alberta-wide agency. And they've got a different program, they've got a different approach, and they've got much better outcomes in terms of the training than traditional methods. So that's an example of how I think there are organizations in this province who are understanding how to do social change better, responding to understanding where the mistakes are being made, and are doing it better. So check that one out, momentsmatter.info.
Maybe focus a little bit too on, I think diversity and inclusion are obviously big focuses for most Alberta businesses. I think, let's use Calgary as an example. Third most diverse city in Canada, now 1/3 of a population that is non-white. We have more people moving to Calgary than any other place in Canada from around the world. And so changing the narrative to be a very inclusive and diversified city has become a big attraction point for us. What are the specific examples you can give us in terms of maybe somebody who's getting diversity and inclusion right versus wrong? And how can we do better with that? Because I think, again, we go back to where we talked about at the beginning, the talent gap is huge. And we have to be much more positioned to attract global talent. And part of that, a global attraction is ensuring that we're doing diversity and inclusion right. So can you give us some good and bad examples of that?
Yeah, there's a useful article in HBR that you might want to, some folks might want to reference. It's called Why Diversity Programs Fail. And it was really a fascinating read for me a while ago to understand what works and what doesn't. And maybe I'll just walk through some of the things that I know from social science that works. And first of all, we know that diverse teams outperform. Like there is like something about diversity in teams, not just diversity of, gender or city or culture or race, but also diversity of thought that produces better outcomes for businesses and for the people who work in them. So being able to work in a diverse team that's trusting and dynamic and innovative and really solves problems differently, there's a lot of value there for an organization and for a person who's thinking about working with an organization. So I think one of the things that works in this space is to talk about the gain, the kind of mutual gain that comes out of diversity programs, because they're there. But typically, some of the problems around diversity and inclusion is that they kind of default toward an assumption that people are biased. And so the focus is on removing the bias, and rather than trying to promote something more positive like cooperation. And let me tell you what I mean. So when you focus, okay, we know people are biased, and that's, the truth is that we are wired to behave or to favor people who are like us. One of the things that there's two ways to go about understanding that fact. One way is to say, okay, we're going to remove that. We're bias by making you aware of that bias. But we know from the research, and in fact, the UK government has stopped implicit bias altogether because of the potential, because it doesn't create more inclusive spaces, and it actually can create division and disharmony and activate biases. And that's because it's kind of like telling people not to think about pink elephants. That's the first thing you think about. And that's kind of how you're wired, and the message is it's hardwired. There's a kind of I can't help it effect. And a better way to approach this this issue is to promote what I call like de-biasing naturally or automatically. And there are ways that you can trigger the automatic mind to think, to behave more cooperatively automatically without having to work at it. And the first one is common benefit, common humanity, common gain. That idea that we are more alike than we are different. Let's focus on our similarities. Let's understand each other as people and what we have in common. And from there, let's talk about where the gaps are and where the differences are. But start from a place of commonality, because that commonality creates an environment that is more conducive to cooperation and collaboration. Automatically happens. And the other thing that I've learned in my research is how powerful found telling stories of good are. Like when you tell stories of good people doing good things for each other, the effect is, I want to be that good. I want to be that kind of person who does equally good, kind, and loving things. And we tend to focus more on like the bad actors and spotlight the people who are getting it wrong and hold them up as examples. What we should be doing is telling stories of these we're doing it right. And that's the thing that creates more of the same. I can tell a little story, which I think is fascinating. There was an incident on the New York subway years ago where a man fell onto the tracks just as the train was coming, and I think he was epileptic, and he was having a seizure, and another man jumped on top of him as the train was coming to stop him from flailing and held him down on the tracks. Just as the train went over both of them, and they both survived. And the story of the subway hero, I think it went national. But though that video has been used in research to understand how to debias people, how to use those kinds of emotional, positive, elevating stories different outcomes in people and how they feel and treat others. That particular story was used in a science in a little experiment to see how people reacted differently to people outside of their group, and it found that people who were exposed to that story were more inclusive, more collaborative, and more accepting of others who were not like them. And so these are examples of how I think we get this wrong. We so much think that we have to focus on the head. We have to educate this part of our brains, but we actually have to educate, like, we have to speak first to the hearts, and then the heads will follow. If we can make people feel safe, if we can make them feel joy, if we can make them feel optimism, that's what helps people feel more cooperative and inclusive and open. We are so inundated with negativity, negative messages, stories everywhere that just make us feel like the world's coming apart. And what result of that is we shut down. Like our brains shut down, we become more closed. We are literally, our peripheral vision gets narrower. We are not open to new ideas. We only want to associate with people we are familiar with, who we trust. And so the world becomes more dangerous, more risky, and we are less likely to be open and welcoming. And that's why I'm a big believer in positive psychology and positive messages and showing people doing the right things and uplifting people and giving them a message of hope. Because here's what happens when you do that. When you give people messages of hope and you induce a positive emotion, you change the way people think and feel and are able to behave. We actually build the skills that are necessary for them to change and be more open and look past differences. And that's what we're missing in this whole conversation, is we're so focused on the negative. We need to focus on the positive. People are actually good, basically good people who want to get better, and we can help them do that.
It's funny because I think, certainly in our politics these days, we focus on the negative. And as a recovering politician who tried to focus on the positive, it's, I think we need to be doing more of that. But obviously we're not there. The media plays a big role in all of that. A lot of businesses, when we see political issues, let's take that as an example. We see political issues coming up all the time. And businesses often ask themselves whether or not they should be weighing in on some of these big political issues. Is this something that they shouldn't be doing? Is this, does this lead to those negative outcomes? I think often, and going back to that positive piece you just talked about, people are sometimes afraid of making the wrong decision, and they feel like any decision is going to be criticized. And so when they should step into a political issue, let's say, they tend to be reserved in doing it because they don't want to say the wrong thing, because we have this overwhelming fear of being shamed and blamed versus trying to get it right. And so what's your take on what businesses should be thinking about? We've got an election coming up in the province. I don't think anybody watching this is agnostic to that. So, should businesses be even thinking about where they sit in terms of the political dynamic?
Yeah, so my take on this is that it's almost a no-win situation, because half the people, again, this is based on research. Half the public wants businesses to weigh in on social or political issues. Half of them doesn't. And then whether you do or not depends largely on your politics and your age. The younger and more left want more activist corporate involvement. But if you do weigh in, then you run the risk of alienating the people who either don't want you to weigh in or who don't agree with you. And so I think, there's just so many examples right now of companies that have been boycotted for their stands on these issues. I think that what it really is directing people toward is finding a way to bring people together, emphasize common interest, and celebrate sort of these core human values that really are hard to argue with. And that way you avoid the controversy, and it does something even more important. And I think this is something people underestimate. It helps strengthen the social fabric. Like, building consensus and cooperation actually makes people want to feel a sense of cooperation. When there's an example a while ago of, do you remember the Heineken ad where they brought two people together with very different political views, and they put them in the same space, and I think they had to build, and then they just watched them, and they were really good friends when they didn't know what their politics were, and then at the end they discovered that they were on different sides of the political fence. I thought that was a really interesting way of Heineken saying, we want to bring people together. We want to, open your world over a bottle of beer, and it's just a nice kind of human umbrella big tent message that people had to, everybody could agree on. I think finding that message for your company is important, but the bottom line is whatever you say should align with your values and your network's values. And I don't think, careful about assuming that you know what your network wants or thinks, because being on the same page with those audiences makes your authentic and meaningful and coherent. And if you focus on a shared vision and shared values and shared goals and those big ideas, I think that comes across much more effectively. Now, there are organizations who do take on a really strong, and Jerry's, I think, is good at this because they are very clear about what they want to do. They're very clear about who they are. They're very clear about being activists in very specific. They do put their money where their mouth is. They promote certain programs, etc. But there's clarity, and their customers share those values. So I think that the problem really comes is when you take a big stand that doesn't align with your audience or your network, then that's where you can get into trouble.
Is there some big company examples of that?
I didn't hear that last question, Jeff.
Oh, sorry. So I was just thinking, again, I love your examples because I think that really highlights things for people. When it comes to some of these companies that maybe they're not aligning with what their customer values expect of them, have you seen a couple of large brand experiences where that's backfired?
Well, the recent controversial one is with Bud Light and who you want to. And I think the biggest problem with that conversation is you saw how they came out after the fact. The first iteration was sponsorship with, well, it wasn't even sponsorship. It was just a gift to trans influencer, and then there was a backlash, and then Bud Light came. They kind of went way back, and they said all we're trying to do is bring people together over beer. So they ended where Heineken started, and so they kind of learned the hard way that a better approach to these situations is to find that middle ground and speak to these big picture values that everyone can agree to. And that's, I think, what people are wanting these days. I think we're tired of being divided. We're tired of fighting, and there's no end of things we can fight about. How about finding can agree on? And if we continue to think about where our differences and where we're so divided, we're never actually going to make things move forward. The chances of that happening are less and less the more polarized we get. So I think that one of the places that can really lead in this space is to be the voice of that sort of that those common values that can make people feel more connected than they do right now.
I like what you said earlier. You know, we've got to start looking at this like we're much more aligned than we are different, and we're much more similar than we are different. I think that's a great perspective and a great way to look at it. We're coming to the end of our time. What's the one thing you want AEG members to take away today?
So the one thing, well, maybe a few things. I would say be authentic, like really understand yourself and live out of those values, and be proud of the impact that you can make in small and large ways on your community. And you do that by being focused and doing something meaningful, whether it's, whether it's adopting a family or changing suicide outcomes. Like, you can have a bigger, but above all, do no harm, and really be careful when you engage in these programs that you don't assume that just because you mean well that you're doing well, because that is not the case.
Well, I think it was a great perspective. I know we could go on and on and on about this, and thank you, Joni, for letting me ask all these questions. Joni offers consulting and training and speaking on how leaders can be better at social change, and how as leaders we can do social change differently and have that impact. So if you want to get in touch with Joni, you can go to LinkedIn at Joni Avram, or her website is causeeffect.ca. And of course, all of those resources and links will be posted on the AEG website. Joni, thank you so much for being here. It was a great chat. I'm really glad we got to talk about this today.
Thanks for hosting, Jeff.
Thanks, everybody.